Anomalies. Anomalies.
Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
Well, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I'm one of your hosts, David Jinks. You can call me Dave, and I'm here with my favorite co-host, one of them, Dan Hall. Say hi, Dan.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm doing okay. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, which will be a little bit of deja vu, but looking forward to it.
Yeah, our guest today is Michael Berger. He goes by Mike, so we're going to call him Mike. He was one of the first people on the scene in terms of questioning the official conspiracy theory put forth by the U.S. government and other governments around the world and the scientific establishment. And he's got a lot of things to tell us about. He's going to point out a whole bunch of anomalies, hopefully, in the official narrative of what happened on 9/11 20 years ago. It's hard to believe we're at the 20th anniversary of this thing. And from my perspective, it hasn't gotten much better in terms of understanding what actually happened on that day, the day that certainly changed the course of history in this nation and probably across the globe. So I want to get right into it with Mike and ask him, right off the bat, how do you think the events of 9/11 in New York City changed the course of history? How will historians look back upon this period in 100 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? What will they say happened?
Wow. You want to start with the hardest. All right.
Well, this is just we'll get into some facts and details, but this is all about what do you think, looking into your crystal ball, what do you think this means for Americans and for humanity?
Well, I guess to try to tackle the first question, it depends on who writes the history. And in the time we now live in, as George Orwell predicted, whoever controls the past controls the future. So I became involved with 911truth.org in 2004. No, actually later. They were founded in 2004. I didn't officially become part of the steering committee until 2006. There were people who I had met who actually began questioning events on the day of. There was one guy I met whose birthday was on September 11th. And that day, on his birthday, he saw what happened and immediately went out and got the domain september11th.org because he knew, and there were many people apparently who were way more in touch with politics who kind of saw through what was happening as it was happening. And I didn't get involved until 2006 when I was asked to be the media person for 911truth.org. And it just serendipitously so happened that 2 weeks after I agreed, without ever having been on national television or done interviews, Charlie Sheen went on Alex Jones' radio show. And the really hard-hitting journalism show, Showbiz Tonight, called us up, and they were going to cover it, and they wanted to know if I could be in a studio in St. Louis in an hour. And that was my first experience in the media. But what was different about it was I was actually called by the producer as opposed to an intern. And the producer, I asked the producer straight up, do you know anything about 9/11? And he goes, no, absolutely not. We just heard Charlie Sheen said these incendiary comments. And I said, can I just ask you, I'll give you 5 points, verify them. And I mentioned 5 talking points. And what was rare was the host was basically, he must have looked up what I said. And those were the words that came out of the host's mouth. So we actually had a very friendly interview. So I was able to talk about Building 7 and other issues at the time. And that was kind of our first big media breakthrough. Then just to give you, I'll pull this together. It may seem a little all over the place, but it's part of the narrative that goes to your question about how history will look at this and what people in the future may or may not know of what happened. the producer then called me back after the appearance and said, can you give us some other people who are part of this movement who we'd like to do a week-long series on it. And that was because their ratings went through the roof. And the next day I called him up and he was no longer the producer. And they did not cover 9/11. And so once we had the breakthrough, and this was at the point where, in my opinion, by 2006, the 9/11 Truth movement had been incredibly successful. 911truth.org sponsored 3 polls: the first New York City poll, Zogby poll, first New York State poll, and then the first national poll, I think in 2007. And at that time, we had well over a majority of Americans not believing the official story and wanting a new investigation. And so if you look at where we are now, the numbers have actually gone backwards. As a matter of fact, I just got poll results that I do think were released. This was a survey on September 4th through 6th, 2021, done by, I think it's a combination of groups, AE, lawyers, and 9/11 TAP, I believe, by Pulse Opinion. But what, to me, the most fascinating thing they asked, how likely are you to trust the US government to be truthful about 9/11? 25% said very likely, 36% said somewhat likely. So 61% of the American public believes what the government tells them about 9/11. 23 said not very, and only 15% said not at all likely. I don't think those are good. The other on building 7, of the people who were aware in the survey, they then asked 576 respondents who were aware of the collapse of 7, what do you personally believe to have caused the collapse of 7? 48% said office fires caused by falling debris from the Twin Towers. Yes, shocking. I find it shocking because the numbers have really gone backwards. And I believe this is a byproduct of the sheer force of propaganda. And propaganda is a lot more subtle than most people think. People picture somebody with a bullhorn yelling at them, but propaganda is way more subtle and unconscious. We're not even aware of it. As biological creatures, we're not even aware that if you look at old research in psychology from like the early 60s, where they used high-speed cinematography to tape 2 people in a conversation, what they found is unconsciously, the speaker and the listener actually mimic each other in facial expressions and rhythms. It's as if the conversation is a dance. And so this year, one of the things, I guess I'm not shocked, but I actually got calls from people in New York City who wanted me to explain to them why they can't find anything that's true in the media. I got a call from a person on Long Island who listens to WBAI, which is the progressive radio station. He was extremely irate that he couldn't find any information that contradicted things that he knew were not true. So I thought that was interesting. Another bizarre thing this year, maybe not bizarre, but so to go to your question about how will history look at this, when I got into this in 2003, it was really the early days of the internet. There wasn't an iPhone and there wasn't really social media. So websites and DVDs were really the means of communication. The 9/11 Truth movement pumped out an awful lot of DVDs and an awful lot of websites. But at that time, the movement still says the same thing. At that time, it was a different media landscape, and the media was very controlled. I've had firsthand experiences doing media where I think most people would be surprised to learn, like, for example, the New York Times, which at least liberals are supposedly think of as kind of the rock solid bastion of truth. So let's connect the New York Times to Building 7. So when Shyam Sunder, the lead investigator for the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, finally comes out with his report explaining the collapse of 7, and then Goes on to say it was due to basic office fires, which has never brought down a single steel structure in the world in 100-year history. And he's asked, did you test for explosive residue, which is by law, fire code. They should have tested for explosive residue to eliminate it on the steel members. Well, he said, well, we didn't have to, because if it was caused by explosives or demolitions, there would have been eyewitnesses who would have heard the demolitions. It would have been as if you were standing in front of the speakers at a rock concert. Now, the New York Times published this, I believe, on the front page verbatim. And what I thought was interesting was the New York Times had sued Mayor Bloomberg's administration because the city of New York got oral histories from all the first responders at Ground Zero. And the New York Times sued, and this was already when Bloomberg was mayor, long after Giuliani was gone. The Bloomberg administration wouldn't release the oral histories. So the New York Times sued and then published them, in which over 100 of the first responders specifically described hearing, seeing, and feeling explosions and compared what they experienced to Las Vegas hotel demolitions. And yet the New York Times forgot that the very evidence that Chaim Sunder claimed didn't exist, they sued and published. So how do you square that? You have other reporters at the New York Times who've actually done very, very good reports about 9/11 that released truthful information. So people want to paint the media with this monolithic brush. How it works, though, is, and I've experienced it, and I still can't tell you exactly how it works. I spent weeks with a Time magazine reporter who was working on a centerfold for 9/11 over 15 years ago. And this went on for 2 weeks, connecting her with different people. And when I called her back to see when they were going to print, she said that the editor quashed it. My own experience on CNN, or actually it was HNN, Headline News, Glenn Beck. So I'd been on television a few times by now, did Showbiz Tonight, where we got a pretty fair shake. When the Pentagon videos were released, the series of still frames, I got a call from ABC World News Tonight. They actually sent the TV crew to me. And they did the interview in my house. The producer was on the phone in Washington. And at the same time I was doing that interview, the executive director, Janice Matthews, was doing an interview with the BBC. And then what we would always do is after we would finish interviews, we'd get off and compare notes. So the producer at ABC asked over and over again, why don't you believe Flight 77 hit the Pentagon? And my response over and over again was, I've never said that Flight 77 didn't hit the Pentagon. I believe the more relevant question is, how could anything hit the Pentagon more than an hour after a plane hit the World Trade Center? That's the real question. And of course, they selectively edited that. So I said that a plane didn't hit the Pentagon. The Washington Post, I had a reporter interview me. And by this time, I had had sufficient experience in the press to tell her up front before the interview, I do not believe you're going to publish anything I say. Mm-hmm. And she goes, well, why would you say that? And I said, because I've been doing this long enough to know how the game works. I said, whatever I'm going to say, you're going to say something else and you're going to attribute it to me. And she goes, well, that wouldn't be journalism. I said, no, it wouldn't, would it? And that was exactly what she did. She sandwiched my quote between Alex Jones and Stephen Jones, put it in quotes, and attributed something to me that I had never said. And when I called her out on it, she told me, well, you can write a letter to the editor. And I said, yes, and he'll bury it on page 42, 8 months later. Nobody's ever going to see it. Mm-hmm. I said, you're not a journalist, you're a hack. I said, where'd you go to journalism school? She wouldn't answer the question, which I don't know what the hell that means, but obviously she isn't a journalist. I don't know what she is. This year, by far, I've not seen the propaganda machine turned up this high on 9/11 in 15 years, easily.
Yeah, let me jump in here because it's pretty obvious where you're going, that history, if the last 20 years are any adequate measure of future history or future historians, you're suggesting that we may not ever get the straight story because of the wheels of this propaganda machine that are always churning and turning and running over independent journalists and with the full weight of the media empire, as well as the academic empire, and just humans apparently pre-installed belief system that conspiracies, in quotes, can't exist. So the weight of all those things moving with the same momentum towards cover up and continued cover up, is that kind of what you're suggesting? Is that we may just never see a resolution or a fair, get a fair hearing of what happened that day for sure? Do you think that there are organizations still like the AE, Architects and Engineers, and the 9/11 Truth, some of these movements that you're involved in, do you think they have a shot? I know that AE 9/11, they're up to 3,000 plus architects and engineers who have signed their names to petitions saying, yes, we need a new investigation because nothing adds up here. They're moving into courts, and they're very persistent, but I think they've been stopped at pretty much every juncture. Can you, first of all, am I correct in sort of assuming what you're saying? And then also, can you tell us a little bit about the legal actions that might be pending to get some of this stuff reinvestigated?
Yeah, all right. So what you were saying about the 3,000 plus architects and engineers, yes, they are involved in litigation with families, getting basically against NIST for basically committing fraud. Then you also have the Lawyers Committee, which is also taking legal action. So far, I don't believe they are. I think they're up to an appeal to the Supreme Court now. But having watched every legal action falter and not even get basically to discovery, I guess to answer your question, I'll reframe it and put it this way. I have, and this is my own personal opinion, I've watched for the last 15 years as we've incrementally watched the Constitution get shredded, and any attempts to stop that process seem to fall on deaf ears. So I personally don't see how you can appeal to the system that brought you 9/11 to hold anyone within it accountable. I don't believe that that process is possible. So I'm going to try to connect all of these dots and go back about how history will review it. I think it's way more complicated. And for this reason, I don't think the average person doesn't have the time to be able to sift the wheat from the chaff anymore when it comes to pretty much anything. We're basically drinking out of fire cannons in terms of the information space we move in now compared to 15 years ago. It's exponentially a different landscape. Anybody can tune in to anything that is in line with their personal biases and never let anything in that counters them. This is a radical shift in American culture. And I do believe it can be traced, in part of this is due to our feeble response as a nation to the terror inflicted upon American citizens, let alone the rest of the world, in the name of a false sense of security. So, for example, in 2004, 911truth.org filed with a complaint with Eliot Spitzer when he was Attorney General of New York. You need to look at, this is, again, down the rabbit hole. Nobody knows this. The head of the National Lawyers Guild was a signatory on our original petition. We had some pretty heavy hitters on the original first board. We worked with the UN. We had Peter Falk, the UN raconteur, agreed with us about 9/11, raised the issues. He got himself in trouble. Anyone who's ever touched it, Dennis Kucinich, Cynthia McKinney, Senator Mark Dayton from Ohio, A few of the Republicans touched it but didn't get scorched, like with Abel Danger. And then you have, I'm trying to think, the strange guy, Senator Rohrabacher, which is interesting because his district is where the San Diego hijackers were. But he was incredibly outspoken about the Able Danger program that used open source data, that a DoD program that had been tracking ATA before 9/11 just based on open source data. So my take on history is, as I've watched the truth leak out in breadcrumbs over 20 years now, unless you understood the trail and unless you had some tethering to some of the initial discoveries that were exposed by mainstream media, this is the irony. They just never connected the dots or gave the American public context on any of these stories. And they came out slowly but surely over an extremely long period of time. So here's an example from just this anniversary. I don't know if you know, how much media you've consumed, whatever sources, but CBS News, okay, we're not exactly talking, this is an InfoWars. CBS News had a headline story, FBI agent says San Diego hijackers had US-backed support network. Now, that same network, I'm sure, ran 50 times as many articles trying to conflate people who look at 9/11 conspiracies with all the problems the country is suffering, including the anti-vax movement, because that's what I saw this year. That was also what I saw in media requests that I took this year. My favorite organization, the New York Times. The New York Times podcast called me for an interview. And on the line, I got a phone line for 911truth.org this year. While you're on hold, I have Bush saying what I told you before we recorded, that in two town hall events televised after 9/11, one in Florida, one in California, Bush reiterated his day at the school in Florida. And he expressed that as he was walking into the classroom, the television was on and he had seen the first plane, but he didn't have time to think about it. That was how he recounted it. And yet nobody, now this text was on the White House website for the full duration of both terms. Not a single person in the media ever asked the president a reasonable question. You said you saw the first plane on the TV as you walked into the school. That footage was never aired until the next day because it was in the video camera of one of the Naudet brothers, a French filmmaker, who was doing a documentary on the fire department and was with them when they made the call to the towers. So there's no way that happened. And yet nobody in the media, then or since, has brought it up. And as each one of these stories would come out, it gets buried under everything else. So this year as well, part of the hysteria was attacking Spike Lee for giving 30 minutes to architects and engineers, Richard Gage, to speak about the physical evidence of the collapse of the towers in Building 7. And as has been true for my experience of the truth movement, 18 years now, progressive and left-wing media are far more critical, believe it or not, than right-wing media. And they viciously attack Spike Lee for giving voice to conspiracy theorists. Now, I guess maybe I'm just a dinosaur at this point, but I thought we had a First Amendment right to express ourselves. And if you don't want to hear it, you tune out and change the channel. But if you don't want to hear it, you don't have the right to prevent me from exercising my First Amendment rights. And we now live in an age of cancel culture, where if people express views that people don't like, they somehow feel obligated to try to shut them out of the conversation. I may not agree with certain people's views, but I have a problem. So like in context of how the world has changed, we live in a time now where Facebook and YouTube are determining who has a First Amendment right to free speech. When did a private company get control of the Constitution? Why aren't people fighting this? This has nothing to do with a conspiracy. It's got nothing to do with 9/11. It's standing up for our basic rights. So as the stories come out, they just continue to go down the memory hole. They disappear. And each year, because of the volume, the exponential growth of information and writing and baloney, it buries the facts even deeper. So in the future, and I can give them, a more nuanced and specific example. There was an international relations professor who, a couple of years ago, called out his own discipline. Their area of study is false flag events. 9/11 is a classical false flag event. So he called out his colleagues and gently challenged them to defend the official story. Why won't we talk about what happened on 9/11? And instead of anybody willing to stand up and debate him, and this was published in Sage journals, and even Sage journals, when they first published it, only published it online and didn't put it, the last time, I haven't spoken to him in a couple of years, but at the time we went to press when I published his article, Sage journals had not put it in the print edition. So even they're censoring him in their own journal, which doesn't really make sense. But he also said, the paper's been downloaded at that time over 1,000 times by academics without a single citation. And nobody's been willing to stand up and defend the official story. So what they did is they attacked him personally. And this is not unique to 9/11. This is happening in all of science. There was an astronomer who's been looking for, I don't know if you guys have run across this one. There's an astronomer who's been looking for objects that are manufactured by a civilization other than our own. You're shaking your head. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I just saw an article today. I don't remember the scientist's name, but it's not radical by any means what he's proposing compared to, the UFO culture and other theories about.
Oh, wait, no, this isn't. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is an older one where he actually has real data and evidence. Yeah, he found an object in space that was reflecting light at a certain brightness and periodicity. Mm-hmm. And after comparing it with other objects, he finally figured out what it was. First of all, it was a man-made object, and it was one of the cylinders from one of the Apollo booster missions.
Okay.
So now he had a signature for a round cylindrical object and what it does to light. Well, he found another object, which was like a flat sheet, a perfectly flat sheet, much further out in space, could not have come from our civilization. Yeah. So he wrote this up, shared it with the discipline, peer review. And he said in the article that he actually had a colleague who is an astronomer say to him, what you're proposing can't be true because if it is, I can't be an astronomer. I don't want to know that. Now, I like your reaction because this is the world we live in now, where, and most people are not honest enough to actually say that out loud and admit that they don't want to know what they don't want to know. But when it comes to 9/11, that's what's going on at a more fundamental level within each of us and then collectively.
You're right. Dan has an extensive background in social work, sociology, and I'm interested in what his take is on this phenomenon that Mike just touched on. How do people, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that, if nothing else, the official conspiracy theory is bogus, it's, in my opinion, it's impossible. But I mean, even if you can't prove that there was some other kind of conspiracy, you can at least rule out the government's narrative. And that's what science is about anyway, right? I mean, it's about ruling out a hypothesis. It's not about proving any specific hypothesis. It's about ruling out things one at a time until you're left with the truth, one thing, which is the truth, you presume. And people still, despite the ability to go out and do this with the 9/11 incident, they're able to convince themselves that there's nothing to look at here. Or they just have a vague impression that, well, the government lies about everything, so I'm just going to mistrust them on 9/11 too. And they can't really tell why they mistrust. But what do you think that psychological and sociological phenomenon is, Dan, that's taking people so far from As Mike pointed out, we're going backwards in terms of our understanding of the facts of this day 20 years ago. How do people end up like that mentally?
Um, hmm. I guess so. As I'm listening to this conversation, here's what's going through my mind. And this may seem kind of redundant, but if you think about it, both you and I and Mike are pretty far into this subject matter. We're down the rabbit hole into the weeds, so to speak. And I think there's a whole bunch of people, and I've gotten some emails from some of them lately. I said we were going to do a show on 9/11. And their response was kind of, oh, yeah, I kind of remember that. Well, kind of remember that is not where we're at. So to answer your question, and then I'm going to ask Mike if he would mind going kind of backwards a minute. I've been reading a lot about cults lately regarding Donald Trump and a bunch of other cults. And mind control tactics are a huge part of what goes on in any kind of propaganda. And Mike alluded to this. It's not standing out there with the bullhorn yelling and screaming, you got to believe this. It's much more subtle than that. So I think that I'm a big proponent of we tend to believe what we hear. As a former sociology teacher, I know that reality is socially constructed. Translation, what people tell you is the truth. You assume they're right, and that's the truth. So what I would kind of like Mike to do, and this is more not for us, it's really not for us because I think, like I said, we're into this subject. This is for the people who might listen to this podcast and not really remember anything but other than 3,000 people died on 9/11. Mike, if you could give us the Cliff's notes of the official version of what happened, and then, and it doesn't have to be extensive, but then use the 9/11 for the truth movement, their counter arguments to rebut that truth. Would you mind doing that?
Sure. I think the most
Exactly.
succinct.
Let me just say one thing.
Yep.
Could you, because there's so many points you could go over, could you maybe limit it to the top, say 3 or 5 pieces of evidence in general that you use to rebut, as Dan said? I mean, because there are pretty easy to understand, bullet points that should cause anyone who has an inquiring mind to go look up, oh, hey, I didn't know that about this. Maybe I should go read about it. So if you could kind of summarize it with your rebuttal points too, that would help a lot.
I think the most succinct summary of the official narrative as laid out in the 9/11 Commission report, which, their final hearings were in 2004, is that 19 radical fundamentalists, kind of on the orders of Osama bin Laden, but really Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, these guys came to the United States below the radar, kept their heads down. The operation wasn't very sophisticated or complicated, didn't require a lot of money. This is the government story. There was no way that the government could have anticipated anybody using planes as weapons. The military wasn't set up to look inward in the continental United States to defend continental airspace. And that basically they succeeded because the government displayed a lack of imagination. I think that would be the most succinct way to summarize their version of reality. And that basically wasn't a matter of incompetence. It was simply a matter that they were taken entirely by surprise. And their systems couldn't respond. Their communication systems didn't work. In fact, one of my favorite topics is the AWOL chain of command, because conveniently everyone in the chain of command was not doing what they were supposed to be doing, and many of them told multiple stories. So that would be, for example, one of the first points to counter is, they claimed that there was no way that anybody could have scrambled planes in time. They gave a million reasons why. But unless you followed this really closely and actually watched testimony back when it was aired or found archives of it online, what came out in testimony painted a different picture than even what they put in the final report. But in the final report, they forgot to mention Building 7. So a 47-story building that wasn't hit by a plane collapses at approximately 5:20 at free fall. They don't think it's significant. They leave it out. In fact, Rumsfeld, I think at one point was asked, and he goes, "Oh no, I don't really know about that building." Well, that building had the second largest covert CIA office in the world. And part of the context of 9/11 that is never brought up in the media, this is while the dot-com bubble is bursting. On September 10th, the NASDAQ had already lost 66% of its value, $4 trillion in 2001 real dollars. So one could even make the argument that, in a sense, 9/11 prevented an entire financial collapse. That is not my argument, but it would be part of it. And there's a good deal of evidence for that, including mostly in the financial press. But so, for example, how I began to question was because I read people talking about people must have had foreknowledge because people made bets on all the world's financial markets that the airline stock is going to go down. So this was easy to verify. You go to the Chicago Board of Options Exchange website at the time, the data was free. I looked at all the airlines' puts and calls, looked at the volume, looked at the numbers traded, and it was inexplicable. Why would they only short United and American and not the other major airlines? Delta, all the other large airlines. It only happened with those two airlines, happened with the brokerage firms that had large numbers of floors leased in the World Trade Center, happened on the insurance companies that insured them. It happened on the reinsurance companies that insured the insurance companies. So that was one of the first kind of threads for me that fell apart. I set out to challenge what I thought these, quote, conspiracy theorists were saying. And then the next thing I know, I became one of them, because as soon as I started looking, the rest of the story, wherever you pulled on it, it fell apart. So I'll give you another. Here's a specific one that 9/11 Truth helped to break, which had to do with the final commission report. In a footnote, says that none of the 4 black boxes from each plane has a cockpit voice recorder and a flight data recorder, that flights 11 and 175, those 4 indestructible black boxes were never recovered. They put this in a footnote and made it quite explicit. I happened to meet a ground zero rescue guy named Mike Berger, who put me in touch with a firefighter named Nick DeMasi. DeMasi's words were published in a self-published book that they put out in 2003. So this is a year before the commission report comes out. And in this book, DeMasi says, at one point I was assigned to take federal agents around the site to search for the black boxes from the plane. We were getting ready to go out. My ATV was parked at the top of the stairs at the Brooks Brothers entrance. We loaded up about $1 million worth of equipment and strapped it into the ATV. When we got into the ATV to take off, the agent accidentally pushed me forward. The ATV was already in reverse. My foot went down on the pedal. We went down the stairs in reverse. Fortunately, everything was okay. There were a total of 4 black boxes. We found 3. Now, what was interesting is we brought this to the attention of William Bunch at the Philadelphia Daily News. I put him in touch with Berger and DeMasi. He verified the story, and he published it right before the November re-election of George Bush. I, being much younger and much more naive at the time, thought this was a major breakthrough. This was going to change everything. Changed nothing. What's interesting is a few months after this, another journalist from Philadelphia, David Lindorf, I believe he sees this story, and apparently he has some kind of relationship with someone who works at the NTSB. So he took the gentleman to lunch, and then he wrote a report which said that the guy told him off the record that the FBI brought those black boxes to him and he examined them. So now we have confirmation from 2 different sources that contradicts the official story. And now, just to put things in perspective, this is a gnat on the back of a giant. And just to go through that one little piece of evidence, you see how much backstory it requires. And then I can tell you what the media did to Mike Malone when this story came out, because apparently what was printed there that they couldn't explain was printed before the commission claimed they weren't found. And these men did try to contact the commission to testify, but they were never called. The media, not only did the media assail them, the fire department of New York actually sent a marshal to arrest Mike Malone. And that was because Mike Malone had artifacts from Ground Zero that he was not allowed to have in his possession. However, he had created a 501c3 called TRACK. And what it did is it went around to schools to help reduce trauma in children from the event. And he would bring the artifacts and show them to the kids. And what wound up happening was when this went into the court, the judge knew him because he was relatively well known. He was the person who stayed at the pile at Ground Zero the longest. He never left. He slept on a pew in the church, and the judge just laughed at them and kicked out the case. Then the media referred to him as a firefighter. So these are the tactics that I believe are used to try to make these people seem like they're not credible witnesses. First, they claim that he told them he was a firefighter, which he never did. On the title of his book, it says he was a volunteer firefighter. Then they claim that he was never made a volunteer firefighter. I have the photos of Nicholas Scoppetta at the ceremony handing him the award. But the media wouldn't retract it or print that. So that's just a tiny thing. Then, of course, there's Building 7. Rather than talk about it, on my homepage, the second video is what I believe is the best edit for the evidence on 7 I've ever seen. It's very, very short, but it is rock solid. And how he found all the video clips of eyewitnesses from the day of describing the explosions explicitly, I do not know, but it's very good. Also, CNN and the BBC had announced the collapse of the building before it collapsed. The CNN clip is actually humorous because they had announced the building had collapsed while it's also in the background live. And then as it goes down, the guy goes, "Look, there it goes."
We told you.
Yeah, it's pretty funny, actually.
Well, maybe that really kind of proves the point that I'm hinting at is that extraordinarily ridiculous things can be said about what happened, and people tend to believe them.
And to answer that point, so I also put up, there's on the very bottom of the homepage, I have one video of testimony about Operation Mockingbird and the CIA's use of MK Ultra. And next to it is a newer video by After School about how an entire population becomes mentally ill. And it's basically through the use of trauma and fear. In ratcheting up fear and anxiety, and for those of us old enough to remember the color-coded fright scale, the terror level,
right?
That it was really funny. I think it was Keith Olbermann at one point did an analysis, and they found out that the terror level was always raised before the White House had bad news coming out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these are examples of how our country, I mean, the greatest shift is, I believe, the malleability of the people's minds. That's why this year, for the first time, I changed the tagline to be "Think for yourself and explore the facts." I mean, I have no agenda. I honestly don't care what anybody believes. The real question is, do you want to live in reality or not? And so to counter, I think what you had said earlier, Daniel, my favorite is reality is what you can get away with, because I think 9/11 is the proof of that theory. That you can have these people say the most outlandish things to your face on national television and nobody remembers it. Nobody seems, like they will say things knowing it's on tape. Kind of like you brought up the cult of Donald Trump. I mean, you have people saying things on tape and then denying they said the things they just said on tape. And so you've got to do some magical mental gymnastics to not have that split your head open.
Even the official narrative, though, is so unbelievable. I mean, you just briefly touched on it. The 19 guys who basically had no money. A lot of them couldn't even speak English, right? All right. They somehow they had box cutters. That was their weapon of choice. And somehow they commandeered these massive jets, and they flew them better than any known pilot has ever flown a jumbo jet, and they with pinpoint accuracy. I mean, it gets more ludicrous the more you look into the details, that just detail after detail. It's just like, come on, who could believe this? So clearly it's because people don't know the details. And my personal anecdote here is probably 10, 15 years ago, I got into discussion about 9/11 at a soccer field of all places. I go play soccer on the weekends, and it came up because of whatever. There was a real libertarian guy who was a good player, and I like to chat with him about the things where our interests merge, like UFOs and cover-ups and stuff. So we were talking about, and this other guy comes in, and I'm like, well, what do you think about 9/11? I still remember clear as day. He said, I don't care. And I was just like, what do you mean you don't care? I mean, it changed everything. It's the start of World War III. Don't you? And he's just like, I don't care. So how do you get to the point, if you don't care, you're not going to look into the details, and you're going to believe stupid things like guys with box cutters can, fly jets like, the best fighter pilot who ever lived. And it's just not going to make any impression on you. And Mike's, analogy of having a fire hose of information directed at your head all the time is a really good one. Paints a real disturbing picture, actually. But anyway, go ahead, Dan.
Well, what I was going to say is I sent you guys something, of course, that I got off the internet, which is a dangerous place to go surfing. But it was the British comedian that took the 9/11 truthers around the country and attempted to dissuade them from being 9/11 truthers. And if you remember that video, they went to some flight school, and one of the people who was in the 9/11 group offers to pilot a plane with a flight instructor, and they get into some kind of a Cessna and they fly around. And so the message there is that these planes fly themselves, and it wouldn't be any different flying a Cessna than it would be flying a plane the size of the ones that crashed into the World Trade Center.
Sure.
So that's what's out there to kind of counteract just what you said, Dave. The complexity of using a Boeing jet as a missile.
So maybe with just a real quick rundown then of some of the real specifics, so like addressing what you said.
Yeah.
We actually happened to interview Fred Sorby of the Sorby Flying School in San Diego, and he told us a couple of interesting. One, he told the hijacker who went there for flight lessons that he would need to learn English before he would allow him to even touch the controls in the Cessna. He also said that on the morning of September 11th, he was awakened by the FBI, and they got all the journals and all the records from the flight school, but they already knew. This was all over the country, by the way. They had stayed in parts of the East Coast of Florida. FBI showed up there. Again, if the government's argument was these guys, this operation didn't cost a lot of money, they flew below the radar. What was really strange is they did everything but what the government claimed. Mohammed Atta at one point rents a Cessna and abandons it on an active runway at Miami International Airport. Hopsicker, Daniel Hopsicker's research in Venice, Florida, his parents retired there. It happened to be where one of the flight schools were. And he's asking, he used to be a journalist for mainstream news. And he was asking himself, why would these guys go to school in a little blue hair community down here? He goes to the flight school and he starts digging, and he finds out that the flight school, the guy who's managing it and running it, Rudy Deckers, is wanted by Interpol. Like, when do you let an international terrorist run a flight school? Then there's all kinds of shenanigans going on at that particular airport. It's the same. It happens to be, if you know who Porter Goss was, who eventually became head of CIA and then was ousted from his position for having, I believe, an affair. This was the congressional district that the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs from. So the Hopsicker's work, again, these are radical fundamentalist Islamists, we were told.
Right.
Atta has a background of being an international drug dealer, not an Islamic terrorist. And in fact, I was in the hearing hallway at the final hearing on air defense when there were gaggle of FBI agents standing around, and I had my camera, and Hopsicker walks up to him and just randomly asks this one female agent, "Are you aware of the flights out of the flight school in Venice, Florida, where the Learjet of the guy who owned the flight school was confiscated on the runway at Orlando Executive Airport with like 50 kilos of heroin, and the guy was doing weekly runs with this leased plane." And she looks at him and says no while she's shaking her head yes. And then she says, "Yes, but I can't speak about it." And then she says, "No, I have no idea what you're talking about." So she's well trained. But I mean, there's just so many beautiful.
The quote fundamentalists whose jihad against the United States. And was it Atta who frequented the strip clubs and went out boozing, or was that somebody else?
No, that's Atta. Several of them.
I mean these
boozing, doing cocaine. He had a blonde-haired stripper girlfriend that Daniel Hopsicker got a video deposition of. They also, rather than keeping their heads down, they all had phone numbers with their real names listed in the white pages. 5 of them trained at a military base in Florida. They had a military base address on their driver's licenses. They came into and out of the country on what, to say the very least, are some questionable visa applications. And apparently Atta was able to come and go from the country while his visa was expired. They were also here long before the commission claims they were here. We know Fox News, Kurt Cameron did a report, a very long, in-depth report, which Fox News scrubbed, of the overlap between the hijackers, the Mossad, and the FBI. So wherever the hijackers had cells in the United States, the Mossad was living around the block from them, and the FBI was tailing them as well. Now, one counter, I mean, we can keep going. So the hijackers, they did anything but lay low. They had police called on them. I mean, it actually quite the opposite of what the government alleges. Rather than laying low, they actually seem to be trying to create a legend that they were there. Another weird one, like if we're going to talk about weird anomalies, if you dig through the commission report, when they asked Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind, why did you pick the targets? Why didn't you go for the nuclear plant on the Hudson right above New York City? He said, well, we assumed it would be defended with missiles. So I guess that means they assumed the Pentagon wouldn't be defended with missiles. Like, as you said, their own story is laughable.
Let me ask you a question about the gentleman you just referred to, Mohammed Sheikh.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Oh, Khalid Sheikh. Is he still in Gitmo?
Yes, he is, as a matter of fact, and I believe they're talking about now actually bringing a trial, but it just got postponed once again.
Okay, because the United States government, this is clearly not only an act of international terrorism, but a crime. Yet they didn't treat anything about this, the aftermath of 9/11 as you would a crime scene. There were statements made that much of the debris from the World Trade Center was essentially scooped up and gotten rid of before an investigative effort could be made toward it. Nobody was really ever charged with a crime, just got thrown in jail. So, I mean,
well,
once
we
again,
invaded the Middle East. I mean, that was the punishment was the U.S. going to Afghanistan for 20 years, The political implications of this.
You brought up two big ones. I mean, the issue, not only has nobody been charged, these people have been detained without ever being charged. Right. The ones who were finally tried, they were actually released because the government had no evidence. There was actually a recent movie, a big time movie, right, about the person assigned by the government to defend them. And he could not get the evidence because it didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they wound up letting this man go. And to me, one of the real interesting side takeaways, but only if you're a thinking person, is in the film, they show that the government claimed this was a high-level operative who was involved in planning the attacks. And it turned out they had nothing on this guy. So if this was supposedly a high-level detainee that justified having no rights and never prosecuting, and then when they finally do, the actual person assigned to defend him actually does his job because he had integrity. They tried to roll over his lawyer, and his lawyer knew what they were doing was wrong and actually stood his ground. It's a rare example of integrity within our government. There are several. Sibel Edmonds would be another case. Mm-hmm. She was an FBI translator who answered the call after 9/11 at FBI headquarters for people who could translate. What's interesting about her is she doesn't speak Arabic. She speaks Farsi, Azerbaijani, and Turkish. They assigned her. Now, this is a high-level post at headquarters. This is top secret, listening to top secret wire intercepts. She's assigned to go back and listen to pre-9/11 intercepts and see if anything was missed. And what she basically alleged, I don't know if you know her story, but she alleged that she found moles in the translation department because the individual people who listened to the tapes marked them as relevant or not. She listened to tapes that were marked not relevant, and they had not only the 9/11 plot, but without knowing it, she stumbled onto a black market nuclear smuggling ring that included people in Congress on these wiretaps. She went through proper channels within FBI to expose the 9/11 issue and the mole, all the way up to Mueller. They basically shit-canned her, and she became a whistleblower. She testified to the 9/11 Commission and the House, Senate Intelligence Committees in a skiff. Both the 9/11 Commission and the Intelligence Committees affirmed the veracity of her claims, but said they had no juice to do anything about it. Then she fought in federal court to be able to go public to name names. I was at the second appeal when that was denied. So the people within the agencies who had integrity and tried to do their jobs have spoken out, hundreds of them, who were obstructed and prevented from doing their jobs, which could have or may have exposed the plot or prevented the plot, especially Colleen Rowley in the Minneapolis office of the FBI. Here, they're following Moussaoui. They want to get a warrant, a FISA warrant, to get access to his laptop, which apparently seems they would have had the plot. FBI headquarters routinely rubber stamps FISA warrant requests. This is before 9/11, right? So you didn't have to go through a special rigmarole. 99+% of them were approved. Hers is rejected. Their office goes around FBI headquarters and finds out that, I believe it was Germany, France, knew his association with terrorism. So they were prevented from getting him. And a weird 9/11 is filled with lovely, strange coincidences. So when their office is prevented from arresting Moussaoui is about the same day that CIA director George Tenet visits Bush at the Crawford Ranch in Florida, which I think is like August 8th. This is the famous August 8th PDB that eventually they were forced to make public. Remember, their story was, this was a lack of imagination. We didn't know people could use planes as bombs. Then the families forced the release of the August 8th presidential daily brief, and the title is Bin Laden Determined to Strike Within the U.S. But of course, the media left out more of the details. The FAA sent CD-ROMs to dozens of airports before 9/11, saying that bin Laden was going to attempt a domestic hijacking. So while one hand is telling us publicly they had no idea, there were very specific warnings. Head of state to head of state warnings prior to 9/11. And in addition to all of this, you've got these guys running in and out of the country on visas where they came through the Jeddah consulate in Saudi Arabia. A former consulate officer, Michael Springman, who worked there during Papa Bush's years, worked for the State Department, said at the time the consulate was run by the CIA. He had issues of failing to give visas to people and having the head of the consulate basically forcing him to give a visa to somebody who clearly should not be getting a visa because they don't meet the criteria. In other words, they could possibly be terrorists. So it turns out that many of the hijackers, most of them, in fact, came through the Jeddah consulate through the Visa Express program. One of the family members, Mindy Kleinberg, in her testimony to the commission, shows their actual visa applications. They were entirely incomplete. They would never have been approved if it was somebody that you or I wanted to bring into the United States. And yet, she has a talk that she gives, which is called like her theory of coincidence. It's one thing if one of these systems failed, but you can't have every system fail. It just can't work. Because one of the ways I would put it is, if none of these systems work, wouldn't we have air disasters every day if the FAA was incompetent? How is that the military right up to 9/11 was giving awards for scrambling and intercepting drug interdiction missions within US borders of Cessnas flying at night below radar? They can find them, but they can't find 4 hijacked planes in New York and claim they have no in our radar awareness. And the biggest question to me that seems the least researched, nobody talks about the Secret Service. There's only one aspect that the truth movement really talks about them, and that's in relationship to the Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, who his open testimony is a joy. Mineta testifies that he goes off script. When he finds out from, I think, CNN, somebody tells him a plane hit the World Trade Center, he's the first person to jump into action, try to ground all the fleet. And then he takes off in his car for the White House and gets there right as they're locking it down, which this was not planned. They send him to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the bunker, and that's where Cheney is. So he's sitting there with Cheney, and in open testimony, he recounts saying, a young man came in and said to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out. And the young man walked out of the room. Then the young man came back into the room a little later and he said, the plane is 30 miles out. Do the orders still stand? And Mineta says the vice president whipped his neck around and said, have you heard anything to the contrary? Of course the order still stands. Then the genius commissioner, co-chair, Lee Hamilton, asked Norman Mineta, not the guy, not the officer, not the vice president, what plane are we referring to? And Mineta says, Flight 77 coming into the Pentagon. And then Hamilton says, what was the order? Well, why won't you ask the people who knew what the order was? Why do you ask the guy under oath who has no clue what he just witnessed? I don't even know how many years it took for the 9/11 truth movement to find out who the young man was, but they did eventually find out. But what this proved in publicly aired testimony is that the vice president is getting relayed real-time information on a plane heading towards the Washington. Now, usually when I do interviews, I'd send a clip from NPR of David Wellna on the steps of the Capitol as the Pentagon has hit. All the Congress critters are running for their lives. They'd not been evacuated or told anything. He goes up to David Wellna goes up to Missouri head of the Armed Services Committee, Ike Skelton, and says, did you have any indication? And Ike Skelton says, oh yeah, the head of CIA, George Tenet, had been up here warning us of an imminent attack that his hair was on fire. Okay, but then they don't evacuate the capital. So in other words, we know that Cheney was getting this real-time info. So the government had to scramble. How are we going to combat this? We can't let it out that he's getting real-time awareness on a plane coming to DC, but nobody scrambles a single plane over an hour after we know what's going on in New York. Inexplicable. So then, of course, they attack Minetta's memory and credibility. So, for example, one of the 9/11 researchers sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Secret Service to get the Secret Service logs because they claimed that Cheney wasn't in the bunker and couldn't have had the conversation because he wasn't brought there until after the Pentagon was hit. So when the records were requested from the Secret Service, they said the records were destroyed. By the way, when the records were requested from the SEC that regulates stock trades on the insider trades, guess what they said? Records have been destroyed.
How convenient.
Yeah, it's very convenient.
The FAA traffic controllers that controlled the flights that morning, their manager recorded a debriefing with them that day in 2004, in April of 2004. That story comes out in the press that the manager destroyed those recordings because he didn't want to violate their union privacy rights. Then, of course, we already covered the black boxes at Ground Zero. For whatever reason, those had to disappear. Otherwise, why would the commission explicitly put in print that they were not recovered when there were eyewitnesses and people who examined them? So there are actual places where the evidence, this is not fuzzy. This is objective. These are facts. This isn't conspiracy theory. And again, why would the plane that hit the Pentagon happen to take out the accountants who had just completed the audit that found $2.3 trillion missing that Rumsfeld announced at a press conference the day before? Now, that was a pretty sophisticated maneuver for a guy who didn't speak English, let alone probably couldn't fly a Cessna, that we're supposed to believe he was at the controls. And yet it doesn't take out the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon where the top brass would be. It happens to hit the one wedge that had just been reinforced with bomb-proof windows and a Kevlar skin that they put the budget analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence in, who had just done the audit. So there's a lot of convenient, some might say convenient, or I would argue, there are an awful lot of convenient moments in the attacks. So, for example, you had the records in Building 7, some of the investigations into Enron and WorldCom.
Yeah, that was Enron, right? Yeah.
Yep, Enron, WorldCom. And you have to remember, before 9/11, there's a direct connection between Enron and Afghanistan and 9/11. Prior to 9/11, Enron had built this gigantic, I think it was $1 billion or $2 billion natural gas power plant in India that was premised on a natural gas pipeline that was supposed to go through Afghanistan. And this is verified, this is in the press, that basically we had threatened the Taliban with a carpet of gold or a carpet of bombs. And all of this kind of implodes before 9/11. They don't get the pipeline, by the way. It went to an Argentinian company called Bridas, B-R-I-D-A-S. 9/11, at the heart of it, I have come to look at as the greatest, most successful financial heist in history on more levels than anybody will acknowledge.
And you couldn't write it up any better as a Tom Clancy novel or some blockbuster Tom Cruise movie. I mean, because everything, like you said, is just coincidence after coincidence. Everything is covered. You know, everyone's butt is covered. Every precaution was taken to let a little bit of the truth out, but also be able to swarm it with propaganda in order to discount it, you know, a classic CIA tactic or an intelligence operation. And so these hijackers, clearly, they didn't know or plan to die, right? I mean, they were...
Well, I mean, we don't know that, but what we do know is, contrary to the government's claim about lacking imagination and not knowing about using planes as weapons, They were actually running multiple war games that morning that mimicked the attacks, and it gets worse. While I'm in the NTSB auditorium listening to testimony, the military is admitting that during one of the exercises, they put false radar returns on the air traffic controller screens in the Northeast. When they were asked in public, when did you terminate that exercise? I'm not sure if it was Myers, Eberhart, who they were asking, which general. And he goes, well, sir, I'll have to look into that. But I believe it was after the Pentagon was hit. What are you talking about? So in other words, to go to your question, if you're running multiple exercises this morning that some involved hijacking commercial airliners, we know that much. So on that morning, there are multiple exercises, live fly training exercises, etc., that we know. They're artificially putting returns, which is why there was so much confusion, and the air traffic controllers were confused about when and where 11 and 175 hit, because they were also chasing phantom returns that the military was putting on there during an exercise. So is it hypothetically possible that these intelligence assets, as opposed to calling them hijackers, thought they were participating in an exercise in the role of a hijacking? Now, again, I can't prove this, but one thing we do know, I sent you guys a link to the pilot episode of The Lone Gunman, which aired on Fox, which actually uncovered the entire plot of 9/11 in March of 01 it aired. And it's rather prescient. Not only that, in that episode, the plane is being remotely flown. The pilots do not have control of the plane as they're staring down the World Trade Centers. What's interesting is Abe Monahan, who single-handedly has filed over 60 Freedom of Information Act requests on 9/11 alone, filed one with the Boeing Corporation to find out whether those planes could have been remotely flown. Guess what the answer was? Yeah, it's as simple as uploading a flight plan to the computer in the plane.
So you mentioned The Lone Gunman. That was an X-Files spinoff, right?
Yes.
Was that
and it
Chris
was
Carter?
Yes.
Who did?
Yeah, Chris Carter.
Gunman?
Yes.
I mean,
Now, of course, with the X-Files, you know that he had to work closely with FBI handlers for that entire show. So I want to go back to one other thing. The whole event was, quote, like a movie. In 06, without any background, I had decided that I was going to make a documentary about this because of what I saw unfolding in our country. And while I focused on the demolition of the buildings, the subtitle of the film is The Demolition of Our Republic, because to me, what I saw happening was that, well, basically where we are now, that if we didn't push back and hold anybody accountable, then in essence, they're given free rein to do whatever they want. There is no stopping them at this point.
How true.
And if you look back, for example, at the documents published a year before 9/11 by the neocons of the Project of the New American Century, these were the same people who sent a letter to President Clinton to invade Iraq in 1998. Then in 2000, they wrote a new defense planning guidance in which they used the term they wanted to justify radically building up defense spending. But in the context of where we were in history in 2001, the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Clinton administration was shutting down military bases. And if you recall, we were promised a peace dividend. Imagine if all the money that went to making war and having all these military bases went to rebuild the country. And then we got 9/11 and that game was over. So that massive
phrase, right? Tell the audience PNAC's.
Oh, yes. So
what
they wanted to do what they wanted to do is they wanted to pull forces from Germany and Japan, and in their words, surround the last remaining basins of oil near the Caspian Sea. Well, shocking. That's exactly what we have done. That's where we've been invading. They named 7 countries they wanted to invade. Shocking. We've been there. And the phrase was, the American public will not tolerate this rapid increase in defense spending without a catalyzing event like
a new Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And on 9/11, they seem to have gotten what they needed.
Mhm.
And remember, before 9/11, Bush was telling people that we're going to go into Iraq. After 9/11, General Wesley Clark was in the Pentagon, and a friend pulled him into his office, and he said, "Sir, they're talking about going into Iraq." And Clark says, "But that has nothing to do with 9/11." And he goes, "Yeah, I know." O'Neill, Secretary Treasury, wrote a book, same thing. So in other words, they had an agenda. An event happens that seemed to catalyze years and years of planning. A few other things that we're not really going to be able to go into, but you couldn't have wired those buildings that day. So this had to be planned out long in advance. And for the things to turn out the way they did, there had to be a strategic plan. And keep in mind, they couldn't control everything, so things didn't go as planned. They couldn't control when the planes took off. That's why they had to improvise when I believe 93 and 77 were delayed in their takeoffs. So that's, I think, like, for example, one could make the argument that all of this was either supposed to happen when Bush was in the classroom or right as he was arriving. So it was a big event. It all happened at once, and they would have plausible deniability for why you couldn't have responded. That's why there had to be improvisation, which left cracks in the story that they had to backfill.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to have the unenviable task of being the timekeeper in these interviews.
Yeah, this is long.
We've had Mike on here for about an hour and a half. So if somebody has more questions, I'm sure we could talk about this for another hour and a half, but if somebody has more questions, do you want to get barraged by emails? Do you want to refer them to the 9/11 for the Truth website for questions? What's your best?
I mean, basically, if you have questions that you cannot find an answer to at 911truth.org, you can send me an email, mike@911truth.org. I actually also have a phone number on the website.
Oh my gosh.
So, yep. And 646-434-0911. Believe it or not, I only had 5 phone calls.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
You might get some more after this.
We'll see. We'll see. I think, like I said, I believe this movement peaked 15 years ago. And I kind of salute you guys for actually looking at the information open-minded and taking it at face value, not what people tell you to look at. It impressed me very much.
Well, what I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
I was just going to say, I know I was kind of all over the place, but
there's so much to cover, though.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's kind of plays into what I was going to say, is that there's so much to cover here. Personally, I'm a geeky data guy, numbers guy. So I went and I read the NIST report, and I read the rebuttal to it and the rebuttals to the rebuttal. And I looked at all the models, the very specific parts of the NIST model that could be disproven easily in terms of how much a certain girder moved off of its moorings, whatever the technical terms, and their modeling of how it crumpled. And so if you have people who are listening to this going, well, I haven't really heard anything that convinces me, I need more hard data, there is so much of it. Just go to A&E 9/11 and look at the reports there. They got all the reports. You can read 100-page reports and get all you want. And 911truth.org, of course, go there. That's Mike's site. It's virtually endless. You can get lost in this. And it's one of those, quote, conspiracies that there's not a lack of evidence. You don't get out of it with the wrong conclusion for lack of evidence. If you go and you read it, I don't think you can come out of it without concluding what we have here, and that there's a lot that's fishy about it, that it most certainly was a planned act. Obviously, some of the details are unclear in terms of who these hijackers were and what their what they thought they were involved in. But, in terms of, was it what the official narrative says, or was it something else? I think the latter is the only conclusion you can come to.
So Dave, I've got a question for you based on what Mike offered. Do you want him to send any additional materials, film clips? And I'm asking Dave because he's the technical guy among the two of us. Do you want any of that stuff that you could put on your YouTube video or not?
I think I could. I mean, I can edit in. I can certainly put web addresses and emails and all the easy stuff in the text, but I can also do stuff on the video itself, especially if you have audio clips or video clips. I'm probably not going to put a picture of Building 7 collapsing because you can go see that anywhere else. But if you have some of those audio clips, maybe I can edit them in, or at least have a link to them directly, because it sounds like you're getting new info in a fairly regular stream. It's not like everything stopped after 2004 or something. We're getting it stream.
It continues to trickle out. It's just hard to find beneath all the garbage.
There's a lot of that misinformation, but there's some good stuff. Some of the firsthand witnesses, they want it to be known. They don't want it to be their legacy, to not have said what they knew about it. And a lot of people, you get braver as you get older. You're like, oh, screw it. I'm going to tell the truth, if nothing else.
Well, Mike, let me thank you on behalf of Anomalies. I'm speaking for Dave here for taking time to be on here with us. Very controversial. We've only done one show in addition to this show that hasn't been about chupacabras or UFOs, but I find 9/11 very intriguing. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invite. I really do appreciate it.
Okay, and we'll be in touch. Don't surprise if you get some emails, or maybe we'll call your phone number too.
Okay.
Yeah, just to make you feel wanted.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, Mike, thanks a lot. Take care.
You too.
Okay, thanks,
Bye.
Bye.
Isn't it a fact, Dr. Rice, that the August 6 PDB warned against possible attacks in this country? And I ask you whether you recall the title of that PDB.
I believe the title was Bin Laden Determined to Attack Inside the United States. Now, the PDB...
You.
No, Mr. Benveniste,
I will get into
I would like to finish my point here.
I didn't know there was a point.
Given that you asked me whether or not it warned of attacks. And
I asked you what the title was.
You said, did it not warn of attacks? It did not warn of attacks inside the United States. It was historical information based on old reporting. There was no new threat information, and it did not, in fact, warn of any coming attacks inside the United States.
Aren't you still amazed the president got a briefing on August 6th before 9/11, about a month before 9/11, a month and a couple of days, that said Bin Laden to attack inside the United States?
Let me tell you something, Chris.
What more do you want?
Well, let me tell you something. The day before 9/11, I called up the White House. I had figured it out. I've been deeply involved with fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan for 5 years. I figured it out. We're about to be attacked in a major terrorist attack. I called up Condoleezza Rice. I had an appointment. She made an appointment to see me the next day on 9/11. And on her schedule it says, see Dana Rohrabacher to be warned about impending terrorist attack.
Wow.
And if I could figure it out, why couldn't the CIA figure it out? I mean, I knew it was.
Well, I'm sorry, but George Tenet having breakfast that morning with David Bourne, the head of the University of Oklahoma, said, "I hope it's not that guy trying to get flying lessons." I mean, how come they knew but nobody did anything?
We've got hundreds of people working over at these intelligence agencies on Afghanistan, on Bin Laden, the number one target, and we weren't warned about something, an operation like this.
NPR's David Welna is on Capitol Hill. David, what's happening there?
I spoke with Congressman Ike Skelton, a Democrat from Missouri and a member of the Armed Services Committee, who said that just recently the director of the CIA warned that there could be an attack, an imminent attack on the United States of this nature. So this was not entirely unexpected. Several members of Congress have talked about the need to step up domestic defense in light of this. There's been a lot of talk about National Missile Defense Shield, and of course what's happened today would not be the kind of event that could be stopped by such a shield, and there's talk already of shifting money into beefing up the National Guard, taking other measures to heighten security domestically to prevent what seem to be further attacks of this nature.
My Chief of Staff, Andy Card, well, actually I was in a classroom talking about a reading program that works. And I was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. The TV was obviously on, and I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And it said it must have been a horrible accident. But I was whisked off there. I didn't have much time to think about it. I was sitting in the classroom, and Andy Card, my Chief of Staff, was sitting over here, walked in and said, a second plane has hit the tower. America's under attack.